excited here to be talking to you a little bit about the learner. So in this phase, you probably already looked at the video that Dr. Shock is using to talk about the learner analysis. So I hope you guys have a really set of good pointers. One of the things that we're trying to do now is definitely understand who we're catering to. So you got to remember in this process, not only in class, but in general, I refer to you sometimes as instructional designers. So if you in fact want to have that role of an instructional designer, your job is going to be and capture, well, first of all, determine what people need so that they can perform a job or they can be excellent at it or they can be superior or they can just do a job, right? And so depending on, sometimes they can't do it, so you need to get them to do it, and sometimes they are already doing it, but you need to help them do it better, and that's part of the needs analysis. So I hope you guys are definitely digesting that information, and you may have to listen to a couple of parts of the video a couple of times from Dr. Shah. Also take a look at the information that we have in the book, and so I just figured I complement that set of information just shortly before you conduct your needs analysis. So you can think about a couple of things and also look retrospectively in terms of what you were doing so that you can also add more context to these learner analysis. So one of the things that I like to bring to your attention is the learning styles. I am mostly sure that you have heard about the learning styles before. This is one point of contention sometimes because some people do say, well, I know my learning style is blah, and they truly believe that is their learning style, but it is more of an observation type of statement. So it's not necessarily that they have been tested or they truly believe or know that that is the most successful style that they can use. Perhaps sometimes that statement is made by people because of their preference. That preference can be influenced by other things, not necessarily by the learning process. But what you're looking at your screen right now is the four different ways in which we usually consume information. So the first one is that visual, the spatial. You prefer using pictures, images, things that are drawn so you can refer to them and see the full picture. Literally, that's like the phrase, do you like me to draw you a picture? And sometimes the answer is, well, yeah, I do. And that drawing the picture, metaphorically speaking, is not literally a picture, but it is writing something down, a concept, a definition, a word, just a keyword, or even an icon. That is why iconography these days is so important. Iconography is, the icons, the graphics that make something. The very first one that comes to mind right now is think about Apple. So they have two, right? That I can think of that come to my mind. So when I hear Apple, immediately the apple comes to mind because that has been their icon for whenever, forever. But the second icon that comes to mind also is their I something. So iWatch, iPhone, gosh, I don't know what else we have, iPad. So while each one of those is different and it is really a phrase because it's text, it has become an icon of some sort. So think about the swoosh of Nike. Same thing. We have the swoosh, we automatically assume that it's Nike and that's trademark. And we can move on and on. So icons are becoming very important because the graphical representation for people is definitely there. Now, the other couple, the other three are the oral. So definitely people that have a very good ear for things. They like to hear the descriptions. They like to hear processes, steps, etc. It's mostly also a sensory representation of rhythm and pacing and change in texture, orally speaking. So those that are auditory or oral, they like to hear inflection in people's voices. When you have a facilitator who has a monotone voice, that person really aggravates those listeners or those oral learners very quickly because there is absolutely no fluctuation in the pacing of the information being received. If you notice, I do have that. I do tend to fluctuate my tone of voice as well as my energy, depending on what we're talking about. And sometimes I just add the umph for specific addressing of a point. So that is very important. But for some people that are not oral, that is not necessarily important. On the contrary, it becomes noise. So we have to be careful about that. So moving on to the other one is we have the verbal. So that's still audio, but it does represent more words. The so instead of just music, so rhythm, representation, etc. Now we are talking about the context, the pure description of a process by means of speaking words, speaking terms, speaking processes, etc. So we like to hear when somebody describes an emotion. We like to hear when somebody's describing a process in an assembly line, etc. So another thing that is important too is when somebody is verbal doesn't necessarily mean that they just will listen. Sometimes it also means that they will read and understand the information in a read format, in reading format. So those who read books, those who read the book. As a matter of fact, in our course, I challenge you to think, how do you consume information better? Do you do better by just opening the book and reading it, or do you like to listen to these explanations, to these video podcasts that exist? So, it depends. It's the same information, it's just digested differently, it's presented differently, it definitely has a different span of time, physical time. I mean, the time that it takes you to read a paragraph is not the same time that it takes you to hear to something like this, and the information is structured differently. So some things to consider. The other style besides the verbal is that physical, and so that becomes a little bit more challenging for us sometimes, because when we are in that saving mode where we don't want to have an instructor in front of the facilitate, I'm sorry, an instructor in front of the students or in front of the participants, showing them how to do something, how to create programs, how to dig a foundation, how to pour concrete, how to create a three-way um, uh, electric circuit, etc. Because it's too costly to do that in person, then we resource to online, right? To computer-based training. And so sometimes that kinesthetic becomes difficult. My traditional example when I used to teach e-learning design about 10 years ago was back then we were even more limited than we are now when it comes to the software to use. We had Captivate. Back then it was called RoboDemo and Flash. But one of the examples that I used all the time was we cannot teach someone to use the forklift in a mean of a simulation. We can show them the picture and the control and the dashboard of the forklift, but we cannot have the person physically maneuver the forklift in the exact way in which it would be in real life. So we have to resource to like games, like some, we do on the remote controls where we push buttons and move sticks. So there is a certain limitation. So that's the issue of the physical or kinesthetic persons when it's online. When it's in person, it's a little bit easier, but it still requires time and it requires the resources. For example, the government, if you think about the armed forces, it's not easy. And I think those of you who are in the armed forces, you can check me on this, but I don't believe the folks in the Air Force are given a $20 million plane for their first flight. They definitely have to go to a flight simulator and even do some other bunch of things before they do that. Now, even the flight simulator is very expensive. I have had the opportunity to get into the flight simulator of the UPS planes. I think the 767 is the last one that I was able to get in. And that simulator in itself is extremely expensive. So the time in it is not easy. And of course, for a civilian like myself, it's nearly impossible to try to use it. So that kinesthetic piece is very difficult. Anyway, so wrapping these styles up, what I like to give you is, and you can see on the screen right now, what I did on the right hand side is I printed a map of the different elements. There are quite a few tests out there on the web that you can take, answer 20 questions, 15 questions, etc., and they will tell you what your learning style is. The one that I remember taking some time ago had this image which breaks down the different constructs, the visual, the logical, the verbal, the oral, and the physical. And it, depending on your answers, it would map out which one was more relevant. Now, this is a little bit more difficult to capture because the logical does not tell you necessarily are you a visual. And the physical, well, the physical is pretty easy, right? That is kinesthetic. So that is apples to apples. The visual also is the pictures, but the logical is the one that can apply in different ways. So that's where it gets a little confusing. But what I did instead is I decided to share with you my learning style. So I took this assessment. It's not, the psychometrics of this assessment are not necessarily scientific, but they are very similar to quite a few instruments that I have used on the internet. So while I cannot tell you that there is one better than another, and of course, the the price usually is what drives people's quality. So if you pay for it, you think it's more valuable. If it's free, you think it may not be. So there is a little bit of truth to that because obviously behind a payment, there is psychometrics, there is a statistician that did some analysis and etc. And behind the free one, sometimes in this case, I am sharing with you one from an organization, educationplanner.org. So I took that assessment and I was able to come up with something that now in this phase of my life I already knew. I know that I am a visual learner, but something interesting that made me think about it, and that's why I like to spend a couple more minutes on this particular report, is my reflection is as we grow older, as we continue to acquire information and interact in different ways at work, with the family, with friends, etc., our preferences become more specific. So if you were to ask me when I was in high school whether I would be a visual person, I couldn't necessarily tell you. But it's probably more like let me show you a picture and tell me what that tells you. So obviously the picture would have instilled more for me to say than if the person would have said to me, I am going to tell you a phrase, tell me what you think about it. Or worse yet, read this phrase and tell me what you think about it, right? So basically what this is telling me now, which now I can tell you that without this assessment, but essentially I look at what I do every day. And so the other day I was looking at addresses. I was going to some locations. I was visiting actually open houses. I just wanted to see new homes and some homes for sale. So the funny thing is, I am riding with my sister, and she's giving me addresses by means of in 1 mile and a half, make it right onto whatever street name, and then in 3/4 of a mile, go ahead and make a left. Now, of course, she had the advantage of reading those addresses or those directions from her phone, so it was easy for her to verbalize that. As I was driving, I had a difficult time understanding what that half a mile was because while I drive, and I've been driving for many years, sometimes I have a good sense of a half a mile, but when I am going in a subdivision, I don't necessarily have a sense of a half a mile. So for me, it was a lot easier to see the GPS on my dashboard. I have a navigation system, and so while I didn't have the address mapped on my GPS, just for simplicity's sake, my sister was just telling me, make a turn here, make a turn there. But I was able to see on the screen the different street names and where there was a left or a right or a dead end, etc. So as she would say, in a half a mile, in 2 miles, in whatever it was the distance, she would give me the name of the street. And so I was able to either see it immediately on the screen and know that it was the third exit visually that I was going to find, or if I didn't see it on the screen, I knew that I had to keep on driving for a while until that street name would show up on my screen. Of course, while being safe because I am driving, so I couldn't really stare at the screen for too long. But you know how that goes. So at that point, it just it was a given, and I knew that I am a very visual person. So this assessment that I am asking you to take in your spare time will definitely inform you how much you are of a visual person versus an oral person versus or an auditory versus a kinesthetic versus or physical, right? So I invite you to follow this address, and I will post this address in our um, discussion board. The discussion board for this week is going to ask you to hunt your learning styles. And I'll ask you to take a screenshot like I did and share it with everybody. And then tell me a quick reflection, just like I did. My reflection again is I know I am a visual learner, and part of the reason is because I do a lot of things that require me to have a visual, like a picture, a map, or like the IKEA instructions that have no words, but they have pictures, and they tell you what pieces go where. So it'll be an interesting exercise. But the reason why I hone in on the learning styles is because we need to know these learning styles as instructional designers for two different purposes. The first one is for the learner analysis, which is what you're doing right now. So you heard Dr. Shuck when he was talking about that example on the photograph of the airman, and he posed the question: Would you build a training for differently for a mechanic than for a pilot? I think it was a pilot. And the answer is maybe. And so if you extrapolate that question into your real world, if would you build a different training for a person that does one role versus a person that does a different role? I think the answer continues to be maybe. And it's not to be impractical or not to be harsh, but simply it's the reality. So we need to find out more, what are the limitations, what are the implications of a person, what are the needs of that person needing to know that skill or needing to know how to conduct a process, etc. But then the other thing that we also need to consider in this analysis is how do they absorb information. Now here's the challenge though. As I am saying that, you're probably going to ask, and this happens very, very, very early on in a company when you're considering onboarding. You don't know who you are going to get, and we don't have a crystal ball that tells us, oh, sure, Jane Ann likes to learn in a visual way, or George likes to learn in an oral way. We don't know that. And we, chances are, won't meet that learner until they are sitting down in front of the facilitator with our materials ready for execution. So there's no way we can do that. Now, that's difficult. I get it. But if we are building training for an audience that we, for the most part, have already profiled, it's a little bit easier because then you have a sense of what is it that they gravitate towards. And so this is usually when you are in a department of learning and development and you have been there, so your tenure is more than 6 months. You are starting to interact with them. You're starting to get those satisfaction surveys. They're starting to tell you, oh my gosh, this really helped me, or the other learner that goes, oh my gosh, you guys, I did not get it. I'm sorry, but you have to show it to me, or I took it 4 times before I could understand it because it was too complex. It had too many numbers. There were no graphics. And of course, I'm leaning more towards the graphics just because I am a visual person. But they could say the other way around. Oh, there were too many pictures. I want you guys to just give me the bullet points and move on. So you have the opportunity to incorporate that learning style as a forecast, so to speak, into your learning analysis. Now, do you need to label it as such? No, absolutely not. So when you create this document that is going to inform me of the learner analysis, where you're going to tell me, the different things that we have talked about, that the book talks about, as far as what is their background, what is their current basic skill, what is it they are after, what are they going to be doing, in how long, what is their demographic composition, right? And that's a lot. We also need to consider how do they learn, what are they more interested in, and again, you have to remember, I am recognizing sometimes you will be able to gather that information, sometimes you won't have access to that information, so it just depends, right? But then Also, it gives you a good profile. And when I was talking about that new hire experience, where we don't know who we are getting. So one of the things that I have talked to my team, the team that I lead in my current job, I tell them that one of the ways in which we can create that profile is by means of experience. So we probably won't be able to get in front of it the first or the second time, but if we run that new hire a couple of times or 3 or 4 times, we will start getting those pieces of feedback through the satisfaction survey. And so the satisfaction survey, that, or that level one, as Kirkpatrick says, which we're going to get into that later, we are getting more information as to what is it that really is important for them. As a matter of fact, I will ask you way before this class is over, what has helped you better? Not necessarily for you to tell me how to, for you to complain about something, although you can, but that's not really going to be serving any purposes. But instead, if you tell me a little bit more what helps you, I can tell you that I have gotten information before about this. People are visual, and when it's an online course, usually people like to hear the discussion because we don't have this ability on a weekly basis in a one-on-one or even in a classroom, right? So the closest we can get is by you typing text messages in the discussion board and for me to give you some of my thoughts in this way. The problem is sometimes, we take too long, which it reminds me we need to start wrapping up here at this recording. But the point is you can create a profile with these feedback pieces that you get from an online survey as to what is it that people are finding helpful. And so that's where you begin composing that profile. And you can say now, usually for this position, X position, we have workers coming in between 18 and 24 years of age. They come from, whatever location, like Dr. Sharp was talking about, making it male versus female. Why is that important and how it can affect or influence the way we deliver content? So similarly, all of those things help us build the learning style profile. So that can be one addition in the learner analysis. But the second benefit of the learning style is the design. So when we are designing content, I'm sure by now it has clicked in your mind. Some people like to see the picture, whether it's black and white or in color, but they like to see the picture. How do we bolt this fastener into that piece? How do we package the widgets that are coming out of the assembly line? How do we fill out this paperwork when we are going to submit it online or in paper-based, snail mail, etc.? Or what button do we need to push to get the forklift started, right? So all of those things are definitely considerations that we need to get. I'm thinking about the different projects that I have read so far about you, and I remember the one that is really coming back to mind right now is the one about telling service people, servicemen and women, what program to take so that it helps them through their retirement. And so, unfortunately, it sounds like that is a decision they have to make, and it's a one-time decision. They cannot go back and forth between it. And once they have made that decision, they're locked in. So, similarly, for them to make that decision, do we paint them a picture or do we just narrate it? Part of me, when I read that proposal, was, well, just go ahead and create a document. Just create an infographic, so to speak. Give them option A and option B. If you pick this is what will happen. If you pick this is what will happen. And to make choice A, these are the things that you need to consider. To decide on choice B, these are the things you need to consider. But as I kept on reading the proposal of this project, I can't remember if it was Donald or Jonathan, one of you guys, but um, you have to consider how the person is going to absorb the information. So if we end up with an oral person, that's definitely not going to work. If we're going to get a visual person, definitely that's going to work. And so the last question that I'm going to leave you with is precisely with this example is how do we know how many people are oral versus visual versus kinesthetic? And we don't know. And worse yet, we cannot cover and solve for every learning style within one learning solution. So the best we can do is definitely consider what we have in these bullet points. What activities are we going to include? So some activities may help the kinesthetic person, but then some content, how we deliver it, is going to help the oral person. So there is going to be music in the background, or there is going to be narration, like you're seeing now. And then in some cases also, if there is a different learning style, what information do we need to procure for the learner, which you are experiencing that in this class. If you notice, not all the content you're consuming for this course is only coming from me, which this was a very purposeful exercise I created. I decided to bring different pieces together because exactly that. I knew that I was not going to get a class of 10 or 15 or 20 participants with the exact same learning style. And I know that. I've been teaching for 14, 15 years in this program. So I know that has never been the case. I do have a couple, maybe five, but not everybody. And so in this case, I am trying to solve for it. Now, the challenge is I am going to annoy some of you, but that's not the purpose. If you can look beyond that, basically what I'm trying to do is give everybody an opportunity. And so as you progress through this class, you can then know, oh, okay, so Dr. Mackenzie has a video. Yeah, I'm gonna skip it because it really doesn't add any value to me. I'm just gonna turn it to the book, and that's perfectly okay. On the other hand, there are some of you that will probably say, I want to listen to Dr. Shuck because he's a storyteller. I really like how he narrates some of his content. And then yeah, I'd like to hear a little bit of Dr. Mackenzie because he provides us with a little bit of context in terms of how I can apply this in real life. Or like in this case, an additional dimension for considering in the learning analysis. So I'm just kind of helping complement. So that curation helps you vary the content so you can attack or serve different learning styles. So I hope as we can continue, you are successful in your learner analysis. And again, like Dr. Shuck mentioned, this learner analysis is not necessarily for the class, it's not necessarily for me, but it's more for you to inform you who you are going to be serving and what is the need in which for what we need to serve them in terms of content. Okay, so I hope this helps, and I'm eager to see your comments on the discussion board about the learner analysis and the learning styles. Until next time, everyone.